In every soul's journey when heaven grows silent, not because God has abandoned the heart, but because the signs have already been given. You prayed for direction while standing before open doors, yet fear kept your hand from turning the handle. The warnings came softly at first, through sleepless nights, broken peace, and truths you tried to bury beneath distraction. But now the hour has deepened, and what was once a whisper has become a trumpet in the conscience. This is not merely another passing feeling, it is the final lantern before the road disappears into darkness or obedience. There are seasons when delay appears harmless, almost wise. A man tells himself he is merely waiting for the right time, the clearer sign, the stronger feeling, the safer road. Yet many souls do not realize that hesitation, when stretched long enough, ceases to be caution and becomes rebellion dressed in respectable clothing. God does not always thunder judgment from the heavens at the beginning. Often, he warns quietly. He stirs the conscience in the middle of the night. He removes peace from decisions that once felt comfortable. He allows an uneasiness to follow you into places that used to entertain, in your spirit. But the tragedy of the human heart is that it can become accustomed even to holy discomfort. You have mistaken God's patience for permission. Because the ground beneath you has not yet collapsed, you assume it never will. Because the consequences have delayed their arrival, you believe they have been cancelled altogether. But there is a fearful difference between God being silent and God being absent. A father may stop repeating himself to the child who has already heard the instruction 10 times. Not because the instruction no longer matters, but because the child has already been given enough light to obey. There are doors you were told to close long ago, yet you continue walking through them as though heaven has changed its mind. There are habits that began as small compromises, tiny cracks in the wall of your spirit, and now those cracks have become gateways through which fear, confusion, bitterness, and exhaustion enter freely. You call it weakness, but deep within yourself you know it is disobedience prolonged by delay. The soul grows weary whenever it carries knowledge it refuses to act upon. This is why some people feel tired even when they rest. Their body will ease sleep, but their conscience remains awake. God's warnings are rarely sent to punish first, they are sent to rescue. The storm cloud on the horizon is not cruelty. It is mercy allowing you time to seek shelter before the rain arrives. Yet pride whispers dangerous things into the human heart. It says tomorrow will always be available. It convinces a person that conviction can be postponed indefinitely without consequence. But time is one of the few gifts heaven never promises in abundance. The longer a man delays obedience, the more normal disobedience begins to feel. Eventually, he cannot even distinguish between his own desires and the chains that bind him. Many people imagine destruction arrives suddenly, but most ruin enters slowly, politely, almost invisibly. A little compromise today, a little numbness tomorrow, a little more distance from truth the next week, until one day, a person wakes up unable to remember when peace left the room. That is why this warning is serious. Delay has a hidden appetite. It feeds upon opportunities, relationships, purpose, and spiritual clarity. It steals not only what you are, but also what you might have become had you obeyed when God first called your name. You keep asking God for another confirmation while ignoring the confirmations already surrounding you. The closed doors, the restless spirit, the repeated conviction, the words that pierce your heart unexpectedly, the growing emptiness in places that once satisfied you, these are not accidents wandering aimlessly through your life. Heaven has already spoken more times than you are willing to admit. And there comes a point when refusing to move forward does not preserve your safety, it endangers your soul. And what makes this danger even more tragic is that the very thing destroying you may also be the thing making you feel secure. Human beings have always had a strange affection for their chains, especially when those chains are familiar. A prison painted in warm colors is still a prison, yet many souls decorate their captivity until they no longer recognize it as bondage. The comfort you cling to has become the silent thief of your calling. It does not wound you all at once. It numbs you gradually, like a slow winter settling over a once living garden. You say you want God's purpose, but purpose often demands the death of comfort before it reveals its reward. The soul cannot hold tightly to both safety and transformation forever. At some point, one must be surrendered. Yet most people spend their lives standing at the edge of obedience, not because they doubt God's power, but because they fear losing the small world they have built around their fears. They remain in familiar misery rather than walking into uncertain freedom. And so they mistake stagnation for stability. There are relationships in your life that have become cushions for your disobedience. They keep you entertained enough to ignore conviction and distracted enough to avoid truth. Some voices around you speak peace where God has spoken warning. They encourage you to remain unchanged because your transformation would force them to confront their own emptiness. Darkness rarely announces itself wearing horns and fire. Sometimes it arrives smiling, applauding your excuses while quietly pulling you further from your destiny. Even your routines can become idols. A man may wake each day, repeat the same habits, speak the same empty words, pursue the same temporary pleasures, and call it living simply because it feels predictable. But there is a difference between peace and numbness. Peace strengthens the soul. Numbness merely silences it. One comes from God, the other comes from avoiding Him for too long. Comfort is dangerous because it convinces you that survival is enough. It whispers that as long as you avoid pain, you are succeeding. Yet no great calling in Scripture was born from endless convenience. Noah had to build while others mocked. Abraham had to leave what was familiar. Moses had to stand before power despite trembling fear. The disciples had to abandon the shores they understood to follow a voice they could not fully explain. Heaven has never specialized in comfortable transformations. God does not merely improve lives, He resurrects dead things. And resurrection always disturbs the grave before it reveals glory. You keep praying for change while protecting the very habits preventing it. You ask God to open new doors while refusing to release the old rooms that poison your spirit. You cannot carry yesterday's chains into tomorrow's purpose. The weight is too great. Yet because comfort rarely feels cruel in the beginning, people defend it fiercely. They call it wisdom to stay where God has commanded them to move. They call it caution to avoid the very risks obedience requires. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, comfort begins to consume courage. The voice of conviction grows quieter beneath layers of routine and distraction. The fire that once burned inside you becomes smoke. And eventually a person who was created to move mountains becomes content merely surviving among ruins. This is why God disturbs your comfort. Not because He delights in your struggle, but because He sees what your comfort is costing you. He sees the gifts buried beneath fear, the calling suffocating beneath compromise, the future dying beneath endless hesitation. And the most terrifying part is that a soul can become so attached to its comfort that it starts resisting the very rescue heaven sends. That is why some people grow angry when truth approaches them. Not because the truth is false, but because it threatens the fragile world they have constructed around denial. Heaven will not endlessly compete with the excuses you continue to protect. There comes a moment when God stops surrounding a person with repeated confirmations, because the issue was never lack of revelation. The issue was unwillingness to obey what had already been revealed. Even will not repeat what your spirit already knows. Deep within yourself, there are truths you recognized long ago. You knew that certain paths were leading you away from peace. You sensed when a relationship began draining the light from your soul instead of strengthening it. You felt conviction when your words became dishonest, when your habits became secretive, when your heart became divided between what is holy and what is convenient. But human nature has a remarkable ability to silence its own conscience when obedience becomes uncomfortable. People do not always reject God openly. More often, they simply drown His voice beneath noise, entertainment, busyness, and delay. The frightening thing about ignored truth is that it does not disappear. It waits. It lingers quietly in the hidden chambers of the soul, like a candle still burning in an abandoned room. You may distract yourself for a season, but you cannot permanently escape what your spirit has already witnessed. That is why some people feel restless even during moments of pleasure. The outward smile survives while the inward man starves. There is an emptiness no amount of success, attention, money, or temporary comfort can satisfy once God has awakened the conscience to something greater. Many keep asking for signs when the real problem is surrender. They say, "God, show me again," while avoiding the last instruction He already gave. But repeated warnings do not always soften the heart. Sometimes they harden it. Every ignored conviction makes the next one easier to dismiss. Eventually, a dangerous illusion begins to form. Because judgment has not arrived immediately, people assume heaven no longer sees their rebellion. Yet silence is not approval. The teacher often becomes quiet during the test, not because he has abandoned the student, but because the lesson has already been taught. God does not waste words. When he speaks to the soul, even softly, it carries eternal weight. The tragedy is not that heaven failed to warn people. The tragedy is that people trained themselves not to listen. Like a man living beside a great bell tower, they hear the sound so often that eventually they no longer notice it at all. Conviction becomes background noise instead of sacred interruption. And still, mercy stands at the door longer than most deserve. God continues sending moments that awaken the spirit unexpectedly. A sentence spoken by a stranger, a verse remembered at midnight, a sudden grief that exposes the hollowness of certain pursuits, a strange ache in the heart during moments that should have brought happiness. These are not coincidences wandering aimlessly through your days. They are reminders. They are heaven refusing to let your conscience sleep completely. But God will not force obedience upon you forever. Love warns, but it does not imprison. The Father may call your name repeatedly, yet eventually the responsibility to answer belongs to you. And if a man continues ignoring truth long enough, he may one day find himself unable to recognize it, even when standing directly before him. The soul was never designed to endlessly resist conviction without consequence. What you repeatedly ignore, you eventually become blind to. That is why this moment matters more than you realize. Your spirit already knows what your mind keeps trying to negotiate away. The battle inside you is not confusion over what God has said. The battle is whether you are willing to let go of the things his voice has already exposed. And this is where the danger deepens beyond what most people understand. Because the human heart is not made of stone at first. It hardens slowly. Every ignored warning leaves behind a small layer of resistance, almost invisible in the beginning, yet powerful enough over time to silence tenderness itself. Every ignored warning hardens the heart a little more. At first, conviction feels sharp. A single dishonest action disturbs your peace for days. One compromise troubles your sleep. One moment of disobedience creates tension within the soul because the conscience is still alive and sensitive. But if that warning is repeatedly ignored, something tragic begins to happen. The soul adapts to what once disturbed it. What once felt dangerous starts feeling normal. The heart learns how to survive in darkness by pretending darkness is light. This is why sin is so deceptive. It rarely enters as open destruction. It enters as gradual permission. A small excuse today becomes a stronger excuse tomorrow. A line once feared becomes a line easily crossed. Human beings possess the terrifying ability to justify nearly anything if they repeat it long enough. The conscience, which was meant to guide the soul toward truth, becomes buried beneath endless compromise until its voice sounds distant and weak. There are people who once trembled at the thought of losing God's presence, yet now they can live weeks, months, even years without seeking him sincerely, and it no longer troubles them. That numbness did not appear overnight. It was built slowly through repeated resistance. Every time heaven warned them and they delayed obedience, another layer formed around the heart. Like iron left beneath rain, the soul corrodes gradually until what was once alive becomes rigid and cold. The frightening thing about a hardened heart is that the person suffering from it often does not realize it has happened. They still speak the same language. They still maintain appearances. They may continue religious routines, offer familiar prayers, even convince others that everything is fine. But inwardly, something sacred has faded. Tears no longer come easily. Conviction no longer pierces deeply. Truth no longer shakes them the way it once did. The soul becomes insulated from the very voice meant to save it. This is why God warns so urgently. Not because he delights in fear, but because hardness of heart blinds people to their own condition. A man with a wounded heart, ND, immediately seeks healing because pain alerts him to danger. But a numb hand can burn without realizing the damage taking place. Spiritual numbness is far more dangerous than spiritual weakness, because weakness still knows it needs mercy. Hardness convinces a person they no longer need rescue at all. And yet, even now, God allows moments that crack through the shell surrounding the heart. There are still flashes of conviction that interrupt your distractions. There are still moments when silence suddenly feels unbearable because truth has entered the room. There are still nights when the weight upon your spirit cannot be explained away by exhaustion alone. Those moments are not accidents. They are acts of mercy. They are heaven knocking against the walls you have built around your conscience. But understand this clearly. Ignored warnings do not remain harmless forever. Every refusal shapes the soul into something. You are becoming softer toward God or harder against Him with every decision you make. No person stands spiritually still. The heart is always moving toward greater surrender or greater resistance. And eventually, if truth is rejected long enough, people begin defend, ding the very chains destroying them. They mock conviction. They resent correction. They call darkness freedom because admitting otherwise would require repentance. The enemy does not need to destroy a soul quickly if he can simply make it comfortable in gradual decay. A hardened heart no longer recognizes danger, even while standing at the edge of ruin. That is why these warnings matter so deeply now, before the conscience becomes so buried beneath compromise that even mercy begins to sound like noise. What you are experiencing did not begin the moment you noticed the pressure around you. The confusion, the heaviness, the sudden exhaustion in your spirit, the strange resistance that rises whenever you try to move closer to God, these things are not always random storms appearing without purpose. The battle around you began long before you noticed it. Most people imagine spiritual battles as dramatic moments filled with visible chaos, yet the greatest wars are often silent. They begin in thoughts, in distractions, in tiny compromises that seem harmless at first. The enemy rarely attacks a destiny openly in the beginning. He studies weakness patiently. He whispers small lies repeatedly, tieredly until they sound like your own voice. He does not need immediate destruction if he can slowly redirect your focus, poison your peace, and separate you from truth little by little. There are battles that started years ago through wounds you never healed properly. Pain entered your life, and instead of bringing it honestly before God, you buried it beneath pride, anger, entertainment, ambition, or isolation. But hidden wounds do not disappear simply because they are ignored. Darkness feeds upon what remains unhealed. What begins as disappointment can quietly become bitterness. What begins as fear can become unbelief. What begins as loneliness can become attachment to the wrong voices and the wrong places. This is why certain patterns keep repeating themselves in your life. The enemy studies cycles. He notices what discourages you most easily, what tempts you most consistently, what fears still control your decisions. And over time he builds strongholds not only around circumstances, but around thinking itself. Some people are trapped not because doors are locked around them, but because lies have become deeply rooted within them. They have heard fear so often that courage feels less unnatural. They have carried shame so long that freedom feels impossible. Yet even now the battle is deeper than what can be seen with human eyes. There are forces constantly fighting for your attention, your loyalty, your focus, and your worship. Every day your soul is being shaped by what it repeatedly listens to. Darkness understands this principle well. That is why distraction has become one of the enemy's greatest weapons. A distracted soul slowly forgets eternal things. It becomes consumed with temporary survival while neglecting the condition of the spirit. Notice how the battle intensifies whenever you attempt to grow. Suddenly distractions multiply. Temptations strengthen. Weariness increases. Doubts grow louder. This is not coincidence. Darkness rarely trembles over a stagnant soul already drifting away from purpose. Resistance often increases when movement toward God begins. The thief does not panic over an empty house. He becomes desperate when something valuable remains inside. And perhaps the most dangerous part of this battle is that many people fight the wrong enemy entirely. They blame people for what is ultimately spiritual. They waste years attacking shadow, while ignoring the deeper war consuming their peace from within. Human anger, jealousy, addiction, pride, deception, and despair are often symptoms of a far older conflict raging beneath the surface. The visible world reflects invisible realities more than most dare to admit. But God has not revealed this battle to terrify you. He reveals it so you will finally awaken. A soldier sleeping on the battlefield is in greater danger than one surrounded by noise and conflict. Heaven is trying to open your eyes to the seriousness of what surrounds you because blind people walk willingly into traps they cannot see. The enemy's greatest victories often occur when people no longer believe they are in a battle at all. That is why you cannot continue treating spiritual matters casually. The war over your soul is real whether you acknowledge it or not. Every compromise strengthens one side of the conflict. Every act of obedience strengthens the other. There is no neutral ground in the unseen world. And while you delayed, distracted yourself, or convinced yourself that everything was fine, forces were already moving quietly around your life, attempting to pull you further from the calling go. Placed upon you before you were even born, and still, despite all the warnings, many people continue bargaining with obedience, as though partial surrender will somehow protect them from the consequences of delay. They cling to temporary comforts, defend familiar chains, and convince themselves that obedience is too costly. But what they fail to understand is this: obedience will cost you less than regret ever will. Every act of obedience demands something from you. Sometimes it demands pride. Sometimes it demands relationships, habits, ambitions, or versions of yourself you have carried for years. God rarely calls a person forward without also calling them out of something behind them. This is why obedience feels painful at first. The flesh mourns what the spirit desperately needs to release. And yet the pain of surrender is small, compared to the devastation of realizing too late what your disobedience destroyed. There are people who spend years running from the very thing that would have saved them. They resist God because they fear sacrifice, only to discover later that rebellion demanded a far heavier payment. Sin always presents itself as the easier path in the beginning. It promises comfort without discipline, pleasure without consequence, freedom without responsibility. But its promises are hollow. What appears easier today often becomes unbearable tomorrow. Regret is one of the heaviest burdens a soul can carry because it feeds endlessly upon memory. A broken bone may heal. Financial loss may recover. Even certain relationships may be restored with time. But regret has a cruel way of revisiting the mind in quiet moments, reminding a person not merely of what happened, but of what could have happened had they obeyed when God first warned them. Few pains cut deeper than seeing clearly the life you abandoned through fear, pride, or delay. And the tragedy is that many regrets begin with sentences that sounded harmless at the time. "I'll change later. One more time won't matter. I'm not ready yet. God understands." Little phrases spoken casually become the seeds of enormous sorrow. Human beings often imagine life-changing disasters arriving through dramatic decisions, yet many destinies collapse through small acts of repeated postponement. A tiny crack ignored long enough can eventually bring down an entire foundation. God's commands are not dear, signed to rob you of joy. They are boundaries built by one who already sees where every road leads. The child touching fire may believe the parent restrictive, yet the parent understands what the child cannot yet comprehend. In the same way, God warns you away from certain paths because he sees the ruin hidden beneath their attractive surface. Obedience is not slavery. It is protection guided by eternal wisdom. The enemy, however, specializes in making obedience appear unbearable while disguising destruction as freedom. He magnifies what you must give up while hiding what you stand to lose by remaining unchanged. He whispers that surrender will make your life smaller, when in truth disobedience is what slowly shrinks the soul. Every compromise reduces spiritual strength. Every act of rebellion weakens clarity. Every delay steals time that can never fully be recovered. And still, mercy remains before you now. God is not merely exposing your danger, he is offering escape before greater consequences arrive. But escape requires movement. Noah could not remain outside the ark forever simply because building it felt difficult. Lot could not linger comfortably in Sodom once the warning came. There are moments when hesitation itself becomes the risk. The longer you stand between obedience and disobedience, the more exhausting the battle inside you becomes. One day, every person will discover that surrendering to God was never the true burden. The real burden was resisting him for so long. The sleepless nights, the inner emptiness, the cycles of fear, the repeated collapse of peace, these things often grow from fighting against the very direction heaven has been urging all along. Obedience may wound your pride temporarily, but regret has the power to haunt an entire lifetime. And there are sorrows in this world born not from failure alone, but from knowing deep within yourself that God warned you repeatedly while there was still time to listen, and that is why this moment cannot be treated lightly. Because the final sign God sends is not meant to crush you beneath fear, but to rescue you before the door closes completely. This final sign is meant to save you, not scare you. Human beings often misunderstand the warnings of heaven. They imagine an angry God desperate to condemn, when in truth many warnings are acts of divine mercy reaching toward people who are already Edie drifting toward destruction. A lighthouse does not scream at ships because it hates them. It shines because unseen rocks wait beneath the darkness. In the same way, God sends conviction, unrest, and interruption into your life not to torment you, but to prevent your soul from colliding with ruin you cannot yet fully see. The tragedy is that many people only recognize mercy after they have survived the disaster it tried to prevent. They look backward with tears and suddenly understand that the sleepless nights, the broken peace, the repeated warnings, the uncomfortable truths, and the closed doors were not punishments. They were protection. God was attempting to redirect them before greater pain arrived. But pride blinds people to mercy when mercy arrives wearing the clothing of correction. You keep asking why God disturbed your comfort, why He allowed certain things to fall apart, why He would not let you remain at peace in places that were slowly poisoning your spirit. But perhaps the greater danger would have been if He had left you alone entirely. Silence from heaven is far more terrifying than conviction. The fact that your conscience still trembles, the fact that these warnings still pierce your heart, means mercy is still reaching for you. There comes a moment in life when every soul stands at a crossroads between surrender and continued resistance. One road feels familiar because it requires no change. It allows pride to remain seated comfortably upon the throne of the heart. It permits compromise to continue whispering excuses. But though that road appears easier, it slowly darkens with every step taken away from truth. The other road feels narrow, painful, and uncertain at first because it demands surrender. It requires honesty. It exposes hidden things buried within the soul. Yet that difficult road is the one leading back toward life. God is not warning you because He desires your destruction. If destruction were His desire, warning would be unnecessary. The very existence of conviction proves the existence of mercy. Judgment whispers, "It is too late." Mercy says, "Turn back while there is still time." And even now, despite all your delays, excuses, compromises, and resistance, heaven still speaks to you. Not because you earned another chance, but because God's patience is deeper than human understanding. But do not mistake mercy for endless postponement. There are opportunities that expire. There are seasons that close. There are moments of conviction that become turning points in eternity itself. A person can resist light for so long that darkness eventually feels natural. That is why this warning carries urgency. Not because God delights in fear, but because He understands what is at stake far better than you do. The enemy wants you to believe this message is meant to shame you, to paralyze you, to fill you with hopelessness. But hopelessness is not the voice of God. God exposes wounds in order to heal them. He reveals danger in order to lead people away from it. Even now, this warning is proof that heaven has not abandoned you. The door is still open. The invitation to repent still remains. The possibility of restoration still stands before you. But the next step belongs to you. God will not drag you into obedience against your will. Love does not imprison, it invites. And somewhere deep within your spirit, beneath all the noise, distractions, fears, and excuses, you already know the truth you have been trying to outrun. You know the habits that must be abandoned. You know the compromises that must end. You know the voice you have been ignoring for far too long. This warning is not arriving to destroy your future. It is arriving because heaven still desires to save it.